and we're going to have a contemporary illustration through the story of Joseph Bondarenko. So Joseph, would you come? This is Vera, Joseph's daughter, and she's going to do the translating, and we're going to hear a bit of Joseph's story. Joseph spent over 9 years in Soviet prisons for 3 different terms. He was in prison for his faith, for preaching, for evangelistic youth rallies. He pastored a church for 27 years in Latvia. I found this really fascinating. I didn't say this in the first service. Joseph and Maria. Oh, we have to have Maria stand up. Maria, would you stand up? This is Joseph's wife, Maria. And they had over 2,000 people at their wedding. I find that amazing. I hardly had anybody at mine. But I want to show you some pictures. This is Joseph's picture. He looks a little different, right? This is from his book that is available on the patio if you're interested. The KBG's Most Wanted. I have read this book. Fascinating story of what Joseph and Maria went through. There they are getting married.
Well, Pastor, you should know why they have 2,000 people in their wedding, right?
Why?
Well, let me tell you. Because at the time, in the communist world, Christians were not allowed for gatherings, and the weddings were only events that believers were able to gather together. And although there were officially invited about 400 people to my mom's and dad's wedding, churches and people around the Soviet Union were coming and streaming to the wedding for the sake of fellowship. So that's how the fellowship took place.
That's awesome. Wow. There's another picture of them looking very serious.
Well, this is their engagement.
This is a baptism in Siberia, and yes, it is cold. Be thankful for our baptistry here, okay? This is a baptism that Joseph led in Siberia of some converts. This is his church in Latvia. Is it Riga? Riga. For 27 years, Joseph pastored this church, and this is just a service there that you can see what it was like. Here is another baptism that Joseph is presiding over. That looks a little warmer. This is a rally. Joseph spent a lot of time in rallies, in youth rallies, and evangelistic crusades. Joseph was referred to as the Billy Graham of the Soviet Union in this book by a few people, and so that was a big part of his life and a big part of, frankly, why he was in prison. So, Joseph and Maria experienced an incredible life. Joseph experienced great brutality in prison, and he's going to tell you a bit about that. One fact I think is kind of interesting, when Maria was 35 years old, she had 4 children, at which point Joseph was sentenced to his 3rd 3-year term in prison. So they know something of a life that I think few, if any of us in our church know. And I want to ask a few questions, and we're going to hear a bit of their story. I put the questions up on the screen so that we can follow along with what they're going to share. But this is a quote from Joseph's book that I found fascinating. Joseph said, "Prison was for me God's university, a master class in humility in the act of loving one's enemies. Gold is tested by fire, and a man by his sufferings. My bondage became the greatest academy where my heart was melted and tested and sanctified for further ministry." And so, Joseph, I just want you to share a bit about that and help us understand how prison changed you and made you a stronger Christian.
Пастор Стив, дорогая церковь, сердечно благодарю вас за возможность поделиться милостями Божьими.
Pastor Steve and the church, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share about mercies of the Lord in my life.
Мне кажется, вам удалось за 5 минут рассказать 6 глав. У вас это получилось.
I think, Pastor Steve, you did pretty good job covering or overviewing 6 chapters of the Acts in 5 minutes.
Не зная, как у меня получится 10 лет тюрьмы рассказать за 10 минут.
And I don't know how will I be able to cover my 10 years of imprisonment in 10 minutes. But I'll try for certain.
В жизни мне выпало пройти этими огненными тропами всем народом Божьим.
God has given me the life to go through the fiery roads on the way and encounter them.
23 года меня исключили с
When I was a
университета
student
за
and I
веру
was
в Бога.
23 years old, I was expelled from the university that I was about to become an engineer of the Navy.
Я думаю, кому из студентов, сидящих здесь, да и мне не очень нравилось
I
сдавать
think we have
экзамен.
students in our congregation today. Do we? Any students? Those who were students? And I know that, yes, thank you. And I know that students, we don't like taking tests or exams.
Мне пришлось сдавать самый важный, самый ответственный экзамен моей веры в условиях тюремных страданий.
And for me in my life, I had to take or be put to an ultimate test. Not on the paper, not on a computer, but the test of my faith and faithfulness to God.
Арестовали меня, когда еще чуть позже мне посадили на 10 лет тюрьмы.
I was shortly
За
after my
проповедь Евангелия.
expel from the university, I was shortly arrested, and my first sentence was 10 years.
Конечно, было ужасно,
I was
страшно,
26 years
переживал
old, and
очень.
it was such a devastating time in my life, and I was very full of fear
Был
and
изолирован от
devastation.
друзей, от молодежи,
I was
от семьи,
isolated
от
from my
церкви.
family, from my friends, from my church, from the activities.
Тем более я знал указания КГБ, которые курировали или контролировали из Москвы мою тюрьму.
And I know from the sources in prison that the KGB headquarters in Moscow actually made a special order and sent it over to the prison that I was incarcerated, that they would make all efforts for me not to come out of that prison alive. So pretty much I was given a death sentence.
И зная, что они решили, чтобы я не вышел живым из тюрьмы, конечно, особо надо было доверяться Богу, молиться и иметь великое терпение.
And when I learned about that, I was in fear, and at that moment in my time, I knew that I could trust only the Lord, Him alone and not myself. Only He could deliver me.
Да, терпение и полное
And
доверие
also
Богу.
I have learned to be patient
И
and
всё то,
trusting in Him alone.
И все то, что было в сердце еще с детства, наизусть стихи Писания, те наставления
And whatever I
родителей,
learned from my
церкви.
home, from my church, learning the scriptures by heart, I have to live that out.
все это так стало полезным, чтобы устоять в вере.
And I reap the best benefit and rewards from knowing the scriptures in my heart because I didn't have a real copy of the
Однажды, когда
scriptures.
была высокая температура, я не смог пойти на работу.
And I
Это
just
страшное
recall the very
преступление.
moment that I write about in my book, that one morning I was required to work because it was a labor camp. And one morning I was not able to get up from my bed because of the high fever and because of the malnutrition, and I was very weak.
Группа надзирателей вбежала в
And
барак,
the several guards rushed into my barrack.
схватили за ноги и руки, бросили в
And,
воду, в грязь.
and they just took me by hands and my legs and just threw me down to the cold water on the floor
И
in the mud.
начали топтать воду и
And with their
грязь
heavy
сапогами.
boots, they were starting beating me in that water.
Я понял, что не убьют меня.
And I just realized that they're going to kill me right there on the
И
spot.
вот тогда я воззвал к
And at that
Господу.
moment, I just lift my voice to the Lord.
И я почувствовал присутствие самого Иисуса рядом.
And that moment in my life, the presence of Jesus was as close as one can ever imagine.
И когда они ушли,
And I felt His real presence like He was
я
standing
так
right next to
молился,
me.
что, кажется, обнимаю пронзенные ноги
And when
моего
those guards
Спасителя.
left, I was praying, and I sensed physically the presence of Jesus, that I was just hugging His feet and telling Him how much I
Я
loved Him.
почувствовал теплоту в
And I
теле
felt
своем.
the warmth in my body that went through whole my body in that cold water.
Я почувствовал чудо исцеления.
And I was healed. I felt the wondrous works of God in healing me that day.
Это изменило все мое существо.
And it changed me so much in trusting God and knowing that
Я
He's gonna
получил
able.
силу от Бога.
And I received the power from God.
И я получил силу любить и прощать врагов.
I received the power from God to love and forgive my enemies.
Сила христианина в прощении.
Because the power of a Christian is in the ability to forgive from God.
Yeah, I'm going to go to another question, but it's interesting that you bring up forgiveness here, because last Sunday we talked about forgiveness at Church in the Park, and there's a really interesting part in this book where at the end of all these years of imprisonment and being brutalized, and frankly, when I read the book, I thought, I don't know how this guy lived through the brutalization. I thought the fact that he's alive is a testament to God's grace in his life. But at the end of it, he stands before some KGB officers who have put him and many others in prison. And he has this great line that we looked at last Sunday at Church in the Park where he says, "As God has forgiven me, I forgive you," from Colossians. And just, wow, really moving. I just want Joseph to reflect on this a little bit. It seems a lot of times Christians who have suffered greatly tend to have a greater confidence in God's providence and plan for their life than those of us who haven't suffered. And that would probably, at least in the same way, haven't suffered. And that would be probably most of us. I don't know if there's anybody here this morning that's spent years in prison for your faith. And I'm just curious if he has any thoughts or reflections on that.
Из опыта скажу, что чем больше скорбь, тем ближе Бог.
From my personal experience, I would say that as sufferings increase, the Lord is coming closer to you.
Чем ночь темнее, тем ярче звезды.
And as darker the night, the brighter the stars.
В истории христианской церкви мы знаем, что когда христиане были гонимы, они были всегда сильнее.
Through the history of the church, we read that in the persecution times, Christians tend to be more strong in those times than when they are in freedom.
Статистика коммунистов в нашей стране говорила о том, что по мере как репрессии увеличивались числом церкви.
And at that time, the statistics that Communist Party came with was stating that as churches were getting more persecuted, the churches were increasing in numbers.
И в это время гонений христиане очень были дружны, единодушны и очень сильными в вере, мужественны.
And those times we witnessed Christianity at its best. They were so strong, so devoted to God and to each other, and especially in love.
И по мере, действительно, Павел сказал, по мере страданий увеличивается благодать и помощь от Господа.
And as Apostle Paul says, for just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abides through Christ.
Как-то на работе я повредил глаза, и на свободе узнали верующие, что я могу стать слепым без глаз.
I had an incident in prison when I had a hard or rough labor, a little speck or fiery piece of metal flew to his eye or through his eye, and he had a big trauma to his eye that was so dangerous that doctors told him that he could have lost his eye. And as soon as believers around the other churches knew about my dad's condition with his eye, literally there were several people from Christian community that literally offered their eye if that would help my dad continue preaching the word of God. That's how much love I've experienced.
Yeah. We've seen in the book of Acts, oftentimes, going all the way back to the imprisonment of Peter and John, that in Acts, I think it's 3, maybe 4, but all they had to do was be quiet. Just stop talking about Jesus. Certainly Paul in his imprisonment here, they're asking him over and over, just be quiet, quit preaching, quit talking, don't share anything about Christ. And I have a sense that the same thing was true in Joseph's life, that if he would have just stopped, they would have left him alone. The question is, what kept you from just stopping?
И мысли даже не было молчать о Господе.
I didn't even have a slightest thought to be silent for
С
the
того
Lord.
времени, как я посвятил всю свою жизнь, детство и юность, я не переставал, не
Since I made
умолкал
my
говорить.
commitment to Christ, to follow Him, and answered His call upon my life, I was never silent. I could not be silent.
Говорил в школе, изгоняли из школы.
I was talking about Christ at school when I was not allowed, and they trying to expel me from just a regular school.
Свидетельствовал в институте,
I was
изгнали
sharing
с
about
института.
Christ in the university, so they threw me out of the university.
Говорил в тюрьме и свидетельствовал, когда люди каялись.
I was sharing about the gospel with the inmates and people coming to know Christ. I witnessed that.
Меня каждый раз по 3 месяца закрывали в
Every
одиночную
time I
холодную
shared about
подземную
Christ
камеру.
with my inmates, I would be punished for 3 months in a solitary confinement.
И в институте спросили меня,
And I had an incident in the university when
или диплом, или Бог, выбирай.
I was given an ultimatum by the dean of the university, and he said, you have to make a choice, Joseph. Either you're becoming an engineer and getting your diploma because it was just shortly before the graduation, or you choose God. It is your choice.
Да, я понимал, что мечта моя будет быть капитаном, будет похоронена.
And I knew at that moment that was a tough decision for me because I was to become a captain of a big ship, and I realized that my dream is going to come to an end should I decide for God.
И я сказал, я избрал небесный маршрут с Богом и остаюсь с Ним
But
навсегда.
God gave me the courage to stand before the auditorium of the students and just boldly proclaim that I chose God and I will follow Him all of my life.
Я верю словам апостола Павла, горе мне, если я не проповедую.
Because I believe Apostle Paul's words were very right. Woe me if I do not preach the gospel.
Yeah. So there's a great part in the book where I think it's the second imprisonment, where they put a tough guy in his jail cell just to basically beat the heck out of him and, just kind of do him in. And that guy ends up becoming a Christian. Joseph witnesses to him, and they're friends to this day. So take that, tough guy. Get
Amen.
saved. And pretty fun. Obviously, Joseph's context was very different than the one in which we live in. Communist-controlled Soviet Union. Atheism is the official dogma of the state. But I'm just curious, why was Christian faith in the Bible seen as such a threat by the Soviet authorities?
Я думаю, что понятно, что две силы, которые были в Советском Союзе, это коммунистическая и атеистическая, они слились вместе, объединились. И это как бы стала империя зла, империя именно сатанинской системы.
Well, I just want to mention that there were two systems that came in together, this atheistic system and the communism. Both of these systems came as one, and they became as a power of evil. It became like an, I would say, era of evil.
Проповедь Евангелия разрушает вот эту именно систему, фундамент этой системы. Поэтому верующие Евангелие, Библия считалась динамитом.
And they were so strong that the only thing that could actually shake their foundation was this power of God through the preaching of the gospel in changing lives. And the Bible at that moment was considered by the communists as a dynamite.
Поэтому коммунисты говорили, лучше пусть будет пьяница, пусть будет вор, наркоман, чем христианин.
I've heard many times communists say to me, it is better to see a human being a drunken, being a drug addict, but in no way a Christian.
Сила Божья, которая присутствовала в простых христианах, она буквально страшила дьявола и разрушала эту дьявольскую систему.
And it's so amazing to see how the power of God, it was just amazing that the power of God in those simple Christian believers were a threat to these people that owned the country and ruled every single soul.
That's so good. Talk a little bit about how we can have the courage of Christian faith and convictions in our culture. We're not going to be put in prison for our faith, but it is a hostile environment out there for many people.
Очень важно В этих условиях быть бескомпромиссным
Number one, we cannot go with compromise.
также не малодушествовать ни в чем,
We cannot be soft-hearted. What do you say?
Wishy-washy.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Thank you, Pastor. Yes.
слушать больше Бога, нежели людей,
You have to listen to God more than to people,
соблюдать Его Слово в повседневной нашей
and
жизни,
daily walk by the light of the gospel and the
оставаться
scriptures,
верными учению, здравому евангельскому
and
учению,
stay faithful to the gospel message.
не терять именно молитвенную жизнь, связь
And
с
it's
Богом,
very important to be prayerful all the time.
не следовать за большинством на зло,
And do not follow the masses for evil.
защищать истину, не
Stand
молчать,
firm and defend the truth. Speak out
подвязаться единодушно за веру евангельскую
and just striving together for the gospel of Christ.
и всегда помнить,
And always remember,
что нам дано не только веровать, но и страдать за Господа.
because we've given the privilege not only to believe in Him, but to suffer for His sake.
Last question. Do you have any thoughts on how we as a church can pray and support those around the world that are suffering because of their faith? Certainly, the Middle East is a hotbed. We see people dying and being chased from their homes because they're Christians, and in many other places. Can you give us a pastoral word of how to help us pray and think and be active?
Да, удивительно, что даже в самых отдаленных уголках планеты нашей, земли нашей, очень многие молились за меня, знали имя и молились.
I have experienced in my family the power of prayer in my life when I was incarcerated or persecuted.
Я их
Many
не знаю,
believers around the globe, whom I don't know personally, but I knew they were praying for
я
me.
их увижу только в вечности.
I know that I will see them in heaven.
Но я испытывал большую радость и силу через
But
эти
those
молитвы.
prayers lifted my spirits all the time.
А также, чтобы церковь постилась
I
и
would
молилась,
challenge and I would encourage the church to have a specific prayer and fasting with fasting.
ходатайствовала перед правительством,
And also to be advocates for those who are suffering for Christ in different countries, as many did for me and my family.
церковь не должна быть пассивной,
We cannot be
И
passive in
равнодушной.
our or indifferent towards the needs and sufferings of people suffering for Christ.
писать письма,
Maybe some of you can just write letters,
Ободрять.
encouraging letters to them, knowing that, letting them know that they're not alone.
помогать именно советам различным,
And sometimes they even would need somebody to be their advocate or give them a timely advice.
быть посвященными в молитвах и
And that
ходатайствах,
support would not be just casual, but it would be a commitment to pray and support them.
Я рад, что дорогие здесь пастора и Стив, и Риди, церковь дорогая, уже является, я там страдал, а они здесь так много свидетельствуют, побуждают людей
And
быть
I know
верными
this
в
church in
страдании.
particular is very sensitive to those that are being persecuted for Christ's sake. Pastor Steve, and we know that you do a lot as a congregation, and we appreciate that because that's what sustained us and helped us go through the circumstances. we were.
Скоро придет время, когда Христос скажет:
And I believe their time is coming soon when Jesus is going to tell us,
«Придите, благословенные, и наследуйте царство
"Well
Отца
done,
моего,
a faithful servant."
ибо был в узах, и вы
Because
посетили
you,
меня».
when I was imprisoned, you came to visit me.
Скажу от сердца,
I can talk from my heart to yours.
не нам, но имени Божьему пусть будет слава за
Not
всё.
to us, Lord, not to us, but to you be the glory.
Thank you, brother.
Слава Богу.
As I invite us to the Lord's table in just a second, I want to point out what I hope is obvious. This morning is not a call for us to try to make ourselves to be like the Apostle Paul or Joseph and Maria Bondarenko. That's their stories, and our stories are different. Your story is your story, and let's avoid the inappropriateness of comparison. Few of us, if any, thankfully, will ever spend time in prison for our faith. But there's a really important point. There's probably a lot of important points, but there's one really important point I want to bring out right now that we can learn from these chapters in Acts and from Joseph's story. And the point is simply this. It just, I think, just oozes out of these chapters and out of Joseph's story. Spiritual conviction leads to spiritual courage. Let me say it again. Spiritual conviction leads to spiritual courage. One of the questions that I asked, and I think it's an interesting one, not only of Joseph, but of the entire book of Acts, is why didn't they just be quiet? Why didn't just Christians fade into the background, and just keep it a family thing and a small thing? But they continued to talk, and in the process, create trouble for themselves. The reason is because spiritual conviction leads to spiritual courage. They believed, and Joseph believed, and I hope we believe, that the gospel is not just one of many stories, but it is the story for the salvation of all men and women in our culture and in every culture around the world. The Apostle Paul said it very clearly at the beginning of his introduction to the book of Romans. He says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile." And I think that's what drove him and drove Joseph and Maria and people around the world that are suffering for their faith, because they're convinced that salvation is only available, knowing God is only possible through the gospel message. One of the problems that I think we face is that sometimes our next door neighbor, our coworker, the student that we're in a study group with, the friend on our softball or soccer team, can know us for years and never know that Jesus is our Lord and Savior, that He's invaded our life. Because there's an intimidation factor oftentimes in a secular culture like ours. Could I say it again? Spiritual conviction leads to spiritual courage. And when we drink deeply of the gospel in our own lives, when we're amazed at what God has done in our lives, when we're just confronted with the truthfulness and the factualness of knowing Jesus, that He has changed us forever, when that happens in our life deeply, then we won't be able to be quiet either. And with love and gentleness, we'll tell our friends and coworkers and neighbors of this good news. Spiritual conviction leads to spiritual courage.